On the night of August 22nd, 2019, around 11 p.m., two men entered an old apartment building in the Gwanak district of Seoul, visibly worried. They were headed to the apartment of their daughter and sister, Choi, whom they hadn't been able to contact since the previous day. One of the men was Choi's father, and the other was her older brother. When they reached the apartment door, they knocked, calling out for Choi, but there was no response. The brother immediately called Choi's husband, who was not at home at the time. During the call, her husband provided the code to unlock the door. With that, the father and brother were able to enter the apartment. Inside, there was silence and darkness. The apartment was neatly organized, as was typical of Choi's meticulous nature, but they found it strange that all the windows were tightly covered with curtains. Even stranger was the fact that the bedroom door was locked. When they cautiously opened it, they were met with a horrifying scene no one could have anticipated. Choi and her 6-year-old son, June, were lying lifeless on the floor. The scene was so gruesome it was hard to describe. Both of them were lying on the bed, surrounded by an overwhelming amount of blood. Their necks had been slashed so severely that it was difficult to count the exact number of wounds. Both victims had suffered vicious attacks to the neck. The autopsy results revealed that Choi had been stabbed 11 times, while her son June had been stabbed 3 times. The wounds were inflicted with such force that the knife had pierced through the mattress. Both had sustained fatal injuries that severed their airways, likely leaving them unable to even scream before they died. Choi and June were both in their pajamas, and there were no signs of a struggle, indicating that the killer attacked them while they were asleep. Who could have committed such a monstrous crime? There were no signs of forced entry or robbery. Additionally, security cameras around the house and the dash cams in the area didn't reveal anything suspicious. The only significant detail was the excessive violence found on Choi's body, and the fact that June's face had been covered with a pillow. This suggested that the killer was familiar with the family and had easy access to the apartment. Clearly, the perpetrator's sole intention was murder. Finding the person who had brutally murdered the mother and her son became an urgent priority. The day before the tragedy, on August 21st at 8:49 p.m., Choi had sent her last message to her family through a messenger app. She was typically active in the family chat, but the next day, August 22nd at 5 p.m., her sister left her a message that Choi never read. This was strange, and at 8:40 p.m., her mother tried calling her but again received no response. This prompted the father and brother, worried by her silence, to go to her apartment that evening. A natural question arises. Why, despite Choi being married, did her family not contact her husband first? The answer lies in the specifics of their family situation. At the time, Choi and her husband Cho were living almost separately. They had married in December 2013, and a year later their son June was born. From the very beginning of their marriage, Cho was deeply involved in ceramic art and fully dedicated himself to his work. This made it difficult for him to contribute to the family's financial life, placing the burden of supporting the family on Choi, who worked at a publishing company. Moreover, Cho often stayed at his workshop, claiming it was necessary for his work, and he rarely came home, only a few times a year. Over time, the relationship between the couple began to deteriorate. Arguments became frequent, and eventually they filed for divorce. At the time of the tragedy, Cho spent most of his time at his workshop, and their life together had almost come to an end. They were essentially living apart. However, during the police investigation, an unexpected fact emerged. On August 21st, the day before the bodies were found, Cho had visited the house. In serious crime investigations, the first people police investigate are the victim's closest relatives, which is a standard procedure. Naturally, the police focused on Cho. Cho, however, maintained his innocence and insisted that he had nothing to do with the murders. He admitted that his relationship with his wife was strained, but according to him, he still visited the house occasionally to see his son. Let's examine his testimony. On August 21st at 8:56 p.m., Cho returned home and found that his wife and son had already eaten dinner. He ate alone late at night. At around 10 p.m., the whole family went to sleep in their shared bedroom. But 3 hours later, at around 1 a.m., Cho woke up. Cho woke up because his son had started talking in his sleep. Cho had always been a light sleeper, and after that he couldn't fall back asleep. He decided it would be better to head to his workshop and try to sleep there. According to his statement, he left the house at 1:35 a.m. At that moment, his wife Choi woke up from his footsteps and told him, "Take the fruit from the fridge," which supported his version of events. At that point, according to Cho, everyone in the house was alive. Surveillance cameras near the house also captured him leaving at that time. However, questions about his testimony soon arose. The autopsy revealed that both Choi and her son June had undigested food in their stomachs. This allowed experts to conclude that they died 1 to 2 hours after eating, but no later than 4 hours after their meal. This finding cast doubt on Cho's statements. He claimed that he came home around 9 p.m. and ate alone because his family had already finished dinner. But if his family died 1 or 2 hours after eating, it meant their deaths occurred before midnight, while Cho was still at home. His account that Choi and June were alive until 1 a.m. no longer matched the forensic evidence. After 41 days of investigation, the police began to view Cho as the primary suspect in the murders of his wife and son. While there was no direct evidence yet linking him to the crime, the investigation uncovered several key details pointing to him. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was the location of the stab wounds on the victims. Choi was lying in bed, facing the wall, with the knife wounds to the left side of her neck, while June had stab wounds on the right side of his neck. These facts led the police to believe that the killer was likely ambidextrous, meaning he could use both hands equally. And Cho, as it turned out, was exactly that. He was left-handed but could easily use both hands. To be more precise, Cho was primarily left-handed. However, due to his work in ceramics, he had developed the ability to skillfully use both hands. This was evidenced by numerous videos of his work that he had once uploaded to his YouTube channel. Upon reviewing these videos, the police became convinced that Cho could indeed be ambidextrous. As for the murder weapon, it was never found. However, surveillance footage from 1:35 a.m. on August 22nd, when Cho was seen leaving the house, showed that he was carrying a bag. The police speculated that the knife could have been inside the bag, which he later hid to cover up the crime. Choi's family had already suspected for some time that Cho might have been involved in her murder. Even when their daughter first went silent, her father and brother initially went to Cho's workshop to see if he knew anything about her whereabouts. His reaction, however, was strange. He answered indifferently that he didn't know where she was, and remained surprisingly calm, despite the fact that his wife hadn't been in contact for more than a day. The most bizarre behavior from Cho emerged after the deaths of Choi and their son were confirmed. He remained shockingly calm and detached, even upon learning of his family's death. One of the police officers involved in the investigation remarked, "I've never encountered a family member of a victim who reacted with such indifference." Moreover, as soon as Cho learned of his wife and son's deaths, the first thing he did was seek legal counsel. This happened even before the official investigation began. The question arose, why did he need a lawyer before the investigation had even started? But that wasn't all. At the funeral of his wife and son, Cho stayed for only 20 minutes before leaving. Just 20 minutes. His behavior was so cold and detached that even his own sister couldn't understand it. When asked about his conduct, Cho explained that the sudden loss of his family didn't give him time to process what had happened. According to him, he was in shock, and that's why he seemed so indifferent. Despite this, Cho continued to deny all accusations. He insisted that there was no evidence linking him to the murders. He maintained his innocence, repeatedly asking, "Where's the proof that I did this?" The police conducted a thorough investigation of his workshop, but found no traces of blood or the murder weapon. However, one crucial piece of evidence did emerge. At the crime scene in the bathroom, traces of Cho's DNA were found. His DNA was discovered on the bath mat in front of the sink and on a towel. The towel was slightly damp, and after being treated with luminol, blood traces were revealed. This suggested that the killer had used the towel to wipe off the blood before placing it in the laundry basket. Cho, however, dismissed this finding, arguing that his DNA being present in their shared home was perfectly normal since he lived there. But the suspicious circumstances continued to pile up. For instance, when Cho returned home on the evening of August 21st, his car's dashcam was turned off, meaning there were no recordings during that time. The next day, Cho bought a new memory card and reactivated the dashcam in his car. However, the police noted that his behavior during the period when the dashcam was off appeared particularly suspicious. At 1:35 a.m., Cho left the house and headed to his workshop, located about 20 minutes away. He didn't leave the workshop until 11:39 a.m., nearly 9 hours later. The police immediately took note of this long time spent at the workshop. Far too long. Investigators began to suspect that Cho might have used the electric kiln in his workshop to dispose of the murder weapon. This kiln, which was used for firing ceramics, could reach temperatures of up to 1,300 degrees Celsius, hot enough to destroy almost any item. The police checked the electricity consumption records for Cho's workshop on the night of the murders and found a sharp spike in power usage at 4 a.m. This indicated that the kiln had been turned on at full capacity at that time. Additionally, just 6 days after the murders, Cho suddenly posted an online ad offering his kiln for sale. This only deepened the suspicions surrounding his behavior. The police quickly responded to Cho's suspicious behavior and seized his kiln for further analysis. Unfortunately, the examination didn't reveal any direct evidence. Despite a wealth of circumstantial evidence pointing to Cho as the prime suspect, no concrete proof was found. This left the case hanging on assumptions and conjecture. The police then began to dig deeper into Cho's possible motives for killing his wife and son. After a thorough investigation, a hidden secret emerged that shed new light on the case. As previously mentioned, Cho's relationship with his wife Choi was far from ideal. From the beginning of their relationship, Choi financially supported Cho. Not only did she cover his creative expenses before their marriage, but even after the wedding, she continued to give him 2 million won every month to fund his work. Additionally, she paid for the rent of his workshop, utilities, tools, and materials. At one point, she even took out a loan to move him into a modern office space of 78 pyong, about 260 square meters, where Cho's workshop was located. Meanwhile, Choi and her son lived in an old, rundown apartment that was on the verge of being condemned. This stark contrast highlighted how selfless Choi had been, supporting her husband and his career at the expense of herself and her son. So what was Cho doing? Cho was far from the image of a caring husband and father. He was cold toward his son, and when his wife expressed her frustrations about this, he would often reply with, "Then let's get a divorce." But soon, an event occurred that became a turning point in their relationship. Choi could no longer tolerate his behavior and constant financial demands. She decided to stop supporting him financially. Choi wrote her husband a long letter, carefully expressing her thoughts. She acknowledged his talent and passion for art, but suggested he find another way to earn money, as supporting his work had become financially unbearable for her. She wrote, "I admire your energy and talent, but it has become very difficult for me to manage financially. Maybe it's time for you to try earning money another way." However, Cho received this message with anger. He felt that his wife didn't respect him as an artist and was deeply offended by her suggestion. In a reply text message, which you see on the screen, he wrote, "So you're saying I can't make money? Do you think my works are just decorative pieces? You say I'm not famous, but who could be better than me in ceramics? You're talking nonsense. I told you before we got married that the most important thing to me is my work." After this incident, Cho stopped living with his wife altogether. Perhaps he no longer needed her support, as she was no longer able to finance him. Could this even be called a marriage? Or was it just exploitation? When Choi stopped her financial support, Cho found himself in a difficult situation. He didn't know how to make ends meet and began borrowing money from acquaintances. But unfortunately, this didn't help either. He soon became addicted to horse racing and lost all his savings. Do you know how much he had in his bank account at the time of the tragedy? Just 1,900 won. During this period, Cho learned something that could have been of great interest to him. He was listed as the beneficiary of a 170 million won life insurance policy on his wife. Moreover, Choi's family had transferred 2 commercial buildings to her name, which would also pass to Cho upon her death. This discovery could have given Cho a strong motive for murder, money that could have pulled him out of his financial ruin. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation and conducted an analysis of Cho's laptop. It turned out that shortly before the murder, he had been actively researching criminal cases involving killings. He was particularly interested in the film The Real Criminal, in which the perpetrator hides the murder weapon, causing the case to hit a dead end. In one key scene of the film, The killer covers the victim's face with a towel and hides their phone under the mattress. You might ask, was this a coincidence or not? After all, at the crime scene, Cho's son's face was covered with a pillow, and his wife's phone was found between the mattress and the bed linens. Coincidence? Unlikely. But that's not all. Now, I'll reveal Cho's biggest secret, one that was hidden from everyone. He had a mistress. Moreover, their relationship began 6 months before his wedding to Choi. After the wedding, Cho essentially lived with this woman in his workshop, as though leading a double life, part of it with his family and the other with his lover. Now it becomes clearer why Cho was rarely home, and why he was so cold toward his wife and son. The police also questioned his lover. She revealed that Cho often expressed regret about his marriage. He even began to doubt that June was his biological son, based on the fact that the boy didn't resemble him. Cho repeatedly mentioned that he wanted to have a paternity test to confirm or deny his fatherhood. However, a test conducted later showed that June was indeed his son. In the end, all these circumstances, financial struggles, a strained relationship with his wife, and the presence of a mistress, led to Cho being charged with murder. In April 2020, the Court of First Instance sentenced Cho to life imprisonment. The court ruled that the likelihood of a third party entering the home was extremely low. The court also noted that financial issues and the conflict with his wife were clear motives for the crime. Cho disagreed with the verdict and filed an appeal. 6 months later, the appellate court upheld the life sentence, affirming most of the findings from the first trial. The court pointed out that the method of the crime, involving the use of both hands, aligned perfectly with Cho's physical abilities. However, Cho filed yet another appeal. In April 2021, the Supreme Court delivered its final verdict, upholding Cho's life sentence. This case became notable for the fact that the prosecution's case was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. Despite the absence of the murder weapon and any video recordings from the crime scene, the evidence collected was convincing enough to find Cho guilty. It could have been possible that, with a lack of direct evidence, Cho might have escaped punishment. But thanks to the meticulous work of the police, this did not happen. Although the murder weapon was never found, the police are confident that Cho carefully hid it. However, even such a detailed plan could not save him from justice. The examination of the victim's stomach contents allowed the investigators to accurately determine the time of death, which became the key factor in solving the case. This case serves as a reminder that a criminal always leaves traces, no matter how hard they try to hide them. May Choi and her son's souls rest in peace after such a horrific and unjust death.